Yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that we record these meetings and we post them on YouTube. So just so you know, and there's a final Q&A part that we stop recording and we just discuss things more freely. Okay. All right. So this is the schedule page that you can always go and check. So far we've had three debates, and today we're gonna hear from Adam. And November is really kind of densely packed. So next week we're going to hear from Anne, and another week after that we have another paper presented by Thelonious. It's not part of the debates, but it's kind of very overlapping in terms of the content. And then the debates, the final one is Tom, who's going to present second week of December. And then in January we're going to have this final actual debate and synthesis. Okay, with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna let Adam take it away. You pull up. Did you send it to me? Yeah, I shared it. Stop. Is it on like Google Slides? Yeah. I can also just pull up. Yeah, maybe try that because I didn't receive the email, but pause recording. There you go. See. Yeah. All right. So I'm assuming people can hear me. If not, just let me know. So initially, when Adi asked me to give a talk, I think he wanted me to sort of represent the more orthodox RL position, borrowing this line from Richard Sutton that like reward is enough. Unfortunately for Hadi, I don't actually think that this is true. I think something like reward is important is closer to what I believe, but that's not very catchy. So then Hadi had the nice idea of saying I literally measured value in the brain, which is funny and at least in the direction of truth, but sounds a little bit arrogant. So just to clarify, I never double checked with Adam. I put it on there, and he didn't complain. So can we just?
I think the Zoom can't see your slides. Could you?
Well, there goes. Thank you for. Okay, let's go. Always happens. Let's go to screen sharing. Share the full. Yeah. Is this okay? How about now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So it was really funny. I had like this, and it was struck through. Okay. All right, but because I don't think that this is maybe the absolute fairest way to frame this. Instead, I'd like to actually title this talk "The Basal Ganglia Do RL." Depending on who you are, this might be like an extremely obvious trait thing. This might be somehow profound, given that we're here at this RL debate series journal club where we are debating whether the brain does RL at all, whether that's a useful framework for thinking about this both decision making and value estimation. I think it should at least be spicy enough to hold people's attention. So, what are some claims that I actually want to defend in the case of this talk? And I should say here that like this is a pretty atypical talk for me. Like I'm quite used to giving a rundown of my distribution RL paper, and I will do that for maybe like a third of the talk here. But that's been published. You can read it if you want. And I thought it would be more fun and more in the spirit of this debate series to actually dig into like some claims that I think some people here will differ on. So the first claim is that the case for RL in the brain is much deeper than dopamine representing TD errors. This is probably the most famous result from this broad literature, and rightfully so. And and I think it holds up. But I think people often just focus in on that to the exclusion of lots of other lines of evidence, including the fact that RL provides a coherent account of behavior, neural activity, not just in dopamine neurons, as well as synaptic physiology, not to mention being outrageously effective in silico. Second claim I want to defend is that RL in the brain need be neither end-to-end nor everywhere. Right? So there are many other learning systems that play in the brain. They're capable of furnishing useful state representations, of learning in the absence of dopamine, of reward, excuse me. But reward can be a very useful signal to steer behavior in certain contexts. And I think that in practice, the basal ganglia are building on top of these representations in order to guide this kind of value-directed behavior. The third claim that I'm going to try to defend is that RL in the brain is probably model-based and policy-based. These are not the sort of frameworks that I would say are most common amongst experimental neuroscience investigations of RL in the brain. Generally, that's because of practical constraints and not because this is what us experimental neuroscientists think deep down is what's really going on. And I'll try to show some interesting examples that break this trend and show, I think, very direct evidence for something like model-based and policy-based RL. Okay, so let's start with like a very, very brief history of RL and how it relates to neuroscience. And hopefully this is going to be new to some of you. Here's like the caricature. I imagine everyone has seen a slide like this at least once, if not many, many times. Yeah, I'm gonna hide these guys. Okay. In case there's someone out there who's not familiar, this is showing a very famous experiment by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues. They're recording from putative dopamine neurons here in the monkey midbrain. They have these thirsty monkeys, and they're getting a juice reward where it says R here. When that reward is not predicted, you get a burst of activity in these dopamine neurons. If you then start pairing the reward with some conditioned stimulus, like a tone or light or something, we see that the bump of activity moves forward to the conditioned stimulus, the CS here, and then you don't see that characteristic increase the prediction reward. But if you were to omit that reward, and so it doesn't come even when it's expected, you get a dip in activity below baseline. So I think this is a very important experiment. I think the caricature of this is something like, some neuroscientists or theorists around and ask themselves what theory would use this classical conditioning experiment. And then lo and behold, in the mid-90s, Schultz, Diane, Montague, and a few other people realized that this formulation of the TD error, which is just the difference between the amount of reward I got at the current time and some discounted prediction of future reward that I'll receive, minus my current prediction of reward that gives me a nice so-called TD error or reward prediction error delta that I can then use to learn. Now, of course, you'll see like there are basically like 3 bits of information here. Okay, there's like response to unpredicted reward, that moves to the CS, and you get the dip. That's like 3 things. That is like not enough data points to constrain a whole theory, much less like a theory with like as much background as RL and all the many ways that this has been elaborated more recently in like the deep learning era. And so, you might think that we sort of just like rushed to embrace this theory when there are many other alternatives, things like modulating learning rate, things like thinking about causal dependencies in the world that all in principle are consistent with these 3 core data points. But I don't think that we only have these 3 core data points. We didn't have them in the 90s, and we certainly don't have them now. So let's look at like some very, very broad classes of literature that I think are relevant here. This might be a bit newer for some people. So first, there was like a very long history of classical learning phenomena. It goes back to like even the 40s, and certainly in the 60s when people were discovering all of these interesting findings, like, for example, blocking. I don't want to like go into what each of these things is. You can read all about it, but just to like briefly review blocking, the idea is that you're gonna, condition, let's say, you have a conditioned stimulus A that you pair with reward. Then later you are gonna jointly condition A and B with reward, and then you're going to ask what the association is with B. You might think, well, B has been paired coincident with reward, so the animal should learn to respond to B, and that is not the finding. And the idea is because A has already taken up all the sort of predictive ability, to bear on the later reward. There's no more error at the time A and B are jointly presented, and since there's no error, the animal doesn't learn B. The broad case here is that blocking and very similar phenomena are indicative of learning from prediction errors, which is maybe not the most intuitive thing once you get down to it. And so if you already have a strong expectation that we should be, on the basis of behavior, learning from prediction errors, then TD error theory becomes a lot more palatable. There are other findings, which, again, depending on where you're coming from, is either like the first thing you learn about or you've never heard of before. So it's just like worth mentioning. Back in the 50s, Holden Milner did a very famous experiment with intracranial self-stimulation. They implant an electrode in various different points along the reward pathway. This is sometimes lateral hypothalamus. This is sometimes septum. The important thing here is that if they stimulate in places that cause the release of dopamine, you get extremely strong behavioral phenotypes, even pathological behaviors, where, for example, these rats will press a lever that delivers them reward to the exclusion of food, to the exclusion of water, to the exclusion of mates. They will run across a path of very painful shocks. If it means that they can deliver this self-stimulation, it is essentially the most extreme motivating stimulus that I think people have ever found in neuroscience. If you block dopamine, this doesn't happen. If you stimulate a place that doesn't cause a release of dopamine, this doesn't happen. So in this sense, I would say it very closely resembles crucial variables in our RL algorithms, and this is a reason why you should strongly suspect that dopamine has a role to begin with many, many decades before we ever were able to record from putative dopamine neurons in any species. By the way, now that I can already feel myself talking for a little while, I should have just mentioned, in case this wasn't obvious, that interruptions are encouraged. If what I'm saying is controversial or not making sense or whatever, just jump in. And I hopefully hear you if you're on the Zoom. Okay, what's the third reason that I think the brain does RL? Well, the nice thing about RL is it's not just a prediction that we should observe a certain variable in the brain. And I think this is actually a pretty generic situation. There's lots of variables that it turns out that you can observe in the brain because you have high dimensional patterns of activity that will correlate inevitably in some way. But instead, RL is a whole framework for how these variables should participate in computation and how they should guide learning. So there are, you would predict specific learning rules if we're talking about artificial neural network, or synaptic plasticity rules if we're translating this artificial neural network into biological neurons. That just by virtue of doing gradient descent on some, in this case, value function, you would expect to see. And it turns out that the empirically observed plasticity rules that we get from these very complicated, often slice physiology experiments, where you have some presynaptic input, you have some postsynaptic depolarization, you have dopamine coming in at some precise time locking. You do this relative, in a particular cell type, let's say in the striatum, that you get things that are either explicable or even predicted on the basis of RL theory. And I think that this is an amazing finding that we really don't have anywhere else in our biology, where we can associate an empirically observed rule with a normative theory. Okay, I do have to talk because there's been some talk on the channels.
Just to connect, would you say what you say about LTP, for example?
I would say that that it's that we have a very good empirical reason for thinking that this exists in some preparations, but we don't really know what it does. I mean, what it does in the case of a normative model. I mean, maybe the best counter that is Hopfield networks. We think it's probably good for long-term memory storage, but that's different from a behavior, optimizing some behavior. Whereas in this case, this potentially allows us to optimize some behavior.
Yeah, because if they block LTP, right? I mean, they would block learning as well, memory.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very messy literature on what it means to block LTP, and if you conditionally knock out an NMDA receptor subunit, is that just blocking LTP or is that doing other stuff?
Synaptic postsynaptic, a lot of these.
So yes, I mean, I would say that there is not nearly the same sort of theoretical scaffolding, and importantly, nobody predicted theoretically what form the LTP rule should have or the STDP rule should have, whereas I think that very much was predicted in the case of RL. Okay. Again, maybe this is obvious, or maybe you're a pure biologist and you don't know this, but I would say a huge fraction of recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and machine learning have either been fundamentally driven by or at least influenced by progress in reinforcement learning. I'll talk later about a DQN, this DPU network that learned to play a target game, similar systems that play Fast or Go, or are a big part of the way that modern LLMs are trained or that are used to train robots, incorporate ideas from RL quite deeply. And then finally, I would argue that modern RL provides fertile ground for many new hypotheses about basal ganglia function. And this is what I'm going to dwell on for maybe 20 or so minutes as I tell you about my previous work. And so just to say, so this is work that I did when I was a PhD student in Naochita's lab at Harvard, in collaboration with people like Sarah, who is on the call. I'm now a postdoc in Yartsev's lab here at Berkeley, trying to extend some similar ideas in a more naturalistic direction. Okay, so I'll assume that most people are familiar with the basic setup of reinforcement learning, where we have an agent taking action in some environment to change the state of the environment and to elicit rewards or punishments from the environment. But a crucial thing to realize about this framework is that each of the arrows in this diagram is in general not deterministic, but allowed to be stochastic, such that, for example, even taking the same action from within the same state might give rise to a whole probability distribution of rewards ranging from very bad on the left here to very good. And traditional RL deals with this source of complexity by simply learning the mean of this probability distribution. But you might ask if it's instead possible to learn the entire distribution, and that's the approach that is taken by distributional RL. And the somewhat surprising fact is that in addition to doing sort of common sense things like enabling risk-sensitive behavior, which we know that humans and animals are capable of in many circumstances, turns out that when combined with deep neural networks, distributional RL is capable of achieving massively better performance across a range of benchmark tasks. So this graph here on the left is showing you, again, on this Atari Games benchmark, which was super influential in the field of deep RL for a long time, that you can achieve performance boosts of like 2.5 times just by switching from traditional to distributional RL without much added complexity in terms of computation or parameters or anything like that. And this isn't just a one-off. This has been used time and time again, and is now, I would say, basically part of the standard deep RL toolkit if you are just designing a system and you want to make it perform better. So a natural question is, if distributional RL works so well empirically, maybe brains do something similar. And this goes to my fifth point, or where we take this powerful computational machinery and we use it to inspire new hypotheses about brain function. And the way that we operationalize this in the context of a neuroscience task is often with something very simple like classical conditioning here, where we have a thirsty mouse. It is smelling odors, and then a few seconds later, those odors may be followed by a reward drawn from a particular probability distribution. And we used 3 unique distributions in this case. So there was a nothing distribution that just had no reward, a fixed distribution with an 100% chance of 4 microliters of reward, and a variable distribution with a 50-50 chance of 2 and 6 microliters. So of course, you'll notice here that the fixed and variable distributions have the same mean but different variance. And so traditional RL doesn't make a systematic distinction between these 2 distributions, whereas distributional RL would. And to really make sure that any difference that we see in the neural activity patterns elicited by these odors are due to the distributions with which they're associated and not due to like something about the odors themselves, we actually duplicated each of these distributions such that 2 unique odors were associated with each distribution for a total of 6 odors. And that allows us, for example, to compare the neural representations between 2 random different odors that have been associated with the same exact probability distribution with the representations to odors that are associated with different distributions with the same mean. We see a systematic difference in this way, and that would be evidence for distributional over traditional RL. And just to emphasize here that when we're talking about neural representations, we're doing this in the period leading up to reward. So the actual reward has not yet been revealed to the animal, and we're talking about their anticipation or their expectations.
Question, please.
Yes.
Or could you speak to the possibility that maybe the abstract reward that goes into the RL algorithm might not be linear in the milliliter amount?
Yes.
Have you thought of that?
Yes, we have thought about that. I think, I took for purposes of time, I took the behavior out of this talk. But so there are different ways in which we try to read out sort of this utility function, which you're saying, like this function that maps units of objective reward like milliliters into units of subjective utility. And so there are various ways that you can do this. One is just with the animal's behavior. So we find that within this reward range, the amount of anticipatory licking that the animals perform tends to scale with the expected reward. In particular, the licking that was elicited by fixed and variable odors was indistinguishable. And not only the licking, but like the entire constellation of behaviors that the animal performs, like it's whisking and it's running and stuff. Even when you like throw all of those predictors into a classifier, even then it was essentially impossible to distinguish fixed and variable odors on the basis of behavior alone. So we think that sort of in terms of the animal subjective utility function, that they are valuing fixed and variable odors equally. There are also tricks you can do at the level of dopamine neurons, which we didn't record in this task, but we've recorded many other tasks with similar reward magnitudes. And basically, you see this feature where the dopamine response is like essentially linear at relatively low reward amounts, like we're using here, and then it eventually saturates. And you can like plot this; it fits very well to a Hill function, and we can basically say on the basis of that previous work that we are in the more or less linear domain of that Hill function.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay, and so so now that we have this task, we can verify the animal's behavior, which I'm not going to go upon here, but I just alluded to, and then we can also record from across the brain. In this case, we're focusing on the striatum, where we expect on the basis of theory these representations of reward or distributions of reward to reside, and that's basically because striatum is downstream of this dopamine input and is essentially what's receiving the learning signal in order to estimate this return distribution. And when we do this, we see a lot of interesting patterns of neuropathy. Here I'm showing you two example neurons. If you're not used to looking at these type of figures, the upper panel here is a raster plot. So each row is a trial, and each tick mark is a spike that is emitted by that neuron on that particular trial. And then the lower panels are peristimulus time histograms, where we just average across trials within a given type. And so what you'll notice here is that the neuron on the left seems to prefer variable odors, far more to these variable odors, whereas the neuron on the right seems to prefer the red fixed odors. And importantly, it's not just that that these neurons are picking out one odor out of 6 that they tend to prefer, like an odor sensitive neuron would. Instead, they tend to fire similarly to both examples of the nothing odors, both examples of the fixed odors, and both examples of the variable. So at least in the case of these two example neurons, they seem to be abstracting over the specific odor identity and instead telling you something about the underlying associated probability distribution. And the last thing to know about this pair of example neurons is that they were actually recorded simultaneously within the same animal. So again, it's not the case that you might have some animals or some sessions where they just prefer the variable odors. Maybe they're in a risk-seeking mood on that particular day. Instead, you can get these diverse preferences across neurons at the same time within the same animal. And so this is the kind of neural signature that you would expect from a distributional RL system in the brain. But the question is, did I just like cherry pick this example, or can we make this sort of systematic across mice and across sessions and across neurons? And so one way to do this is to take every single neuron that we recorded. You can select for the striatum. You can look at particular subregions of the striatum. I think in this case we kept it simple and we literally just took all the neurons and perform PCA on that high-dimensional pattern of neural activity across different trial types, and then project it down into just the first 2 PCs. You generally get a picture that looks like this, and then you can just very simply measure the distances along each PC between different pairs of odors. And if we start by doing this between distances between, let's say, a nothing odor and then a rewarded odor, whether that's fixed or variable, and we compare that to the distances along PC1 between one fixed and one variable odor, we unsurprisingly find that these across mean differences in gray swamp the within mean differences in cyan. And so this is like the bedrock pre-existing finding that everyone already knew about the ventral striatum. It represents at the very least mean value, and so differences in mean value should be extremely evident at the level of this population segment. But where things get more interesting is we can play a similar trick now along PC2. If we measure the distances between one fixed and one variable odor, which I'm showing with these green arrows. There are 4 ways to do this. Compare that to the distances between, let's say, one example of the fixed odors and the other example of the fixed odors, or ditto for the variable odors. That's what I'm showing in the orange arrows here. And we now compare those distances along PC2. We find that these across distribution pairs are better separated along PC2 than are the within distribution pairs. And this is the unique prediction of distributional RL and not traditional RL. Yes.
Variance of
It depends on the particular task and the particular set of odors. And keep in mind, we're talking about, we're taking averages within the late trace window of activity. So it's just these 6 data points. My recollection is it's roughly 60% PC1, 20% PC2, and then higher order PCs, which aren't systematic, make up the remainder. But it does depend on the particular set of distributions. Okay, so this is just one I think very intuitive visualization that I have just to reassure everyone here. This does not depend on the specifics of PCA or doing any dimensionality reduction whatsoever. You can, it doesn't depend on trial averaging. You can get this on single trials and all the ways that you expect. Essentially glossing over all of that here, but you're welcome to check out the paper. And I promise you, this is an extremely robust finding that holds up quite well across, the 14,000 or so neurons that we recorded in this data set. And so, if we take for granted then that the stratum really is learning the reward distribution in some way, we can ask, how this might be working. So to give you, a bit of a taste of how most neuroscientists think about RL and these kinds of simplified classical conditioning tasks, we have a very simple 2-step algorithm. Oh yeah, there's a raised hand. Julie?
Hey, yeah, thank you. I was wondering, before you dive into your model, if you look at the PCs, do you have any information in the temporal domain? What are those PCs corresponds to? Is there an information about when this information, about the reward value is popping up in the brain in those different setups, for the fixed and variable?
Yeah, so I also did PCA in the temporal setting where you concatenate sort of the average response to each trial type. You can concatenate them in time. This particular, and in that case, most of the top PCs are picking out different sort of temporal relationships across the mean value. So this PCA is getting rid of all that temporal information. So if you do it blockwise, so you could do this, for example, during the odor period, then during the early trace period, and then during the late trace period. But I do find that, for example, the odor period ends up being dominated by odor-specific information, even in the stratum. This was actually a bit of a surprise to us. There's so much, sensory-specific information. This sort of cuts against sort of the most naive models of RL in the brain. And then this, odor information sort of starts to wash out over the course of the trace period and ends up being replaced dominantly by this reward-related information, both at the level of the mean and at the level of higher order moments above the mean. Is that sort of answer your question?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Better. Thanks.
Okay, so there, these sorts of algorithms work in 2 steps. So in the first step, we compute again this reward prediction error. In this very simplified case, we're not even talking about a TD error. We're just talking about a simple difference between the reward that you received on that trial and your expectation on that trial. And then in the second step of the algorithm, we use that reward prediction error delta to update our representation of value V by simply multiplying it by a small learning rate, a positive learning rate alpha. And if you visualize what this algorithm does over the course of many hundreds or thousands of trials, you see that in the case of something like the nothing odor, the value predictor is going to converge to the true reward that's given on that trial with 100% probability, which in this case is 0. Same for the fixed. But in case of these variable odors, when we have a 50-50 chance of two reward sizes, this value predictor learning under this learning rule is going to converge to the mean of the reward distribution. And that's something that you can prove relatively easily. I won't go into that here. So now we can extend this learning rule in a few ways and turn it into a distributional RL learning rule. So the first modification that we're going to make is rather than a single, can people see my cursor? I guess probably. Rather than a single value predictor V here, we're going to broaden this to a family of value predictors indexed by I here, and that's going to give rise to a corresponding family of RPE channels, delta I. And then the second modification that we're going to make is by allowing each member of that family to take different learning rates, whether delta is positive or negative for that particular predictor. And when you do that, you end up seeing something like this. Again, I'm plotting trials out here on the x-axis and the value of each reward, or each value predictor here on the y-axis. And those value predictors might range from very pessimistic to very optimistic. We see that the pessimistic predictors will converge down to a lower estimate very fast because of their relatively higher alpha minus here, whereas the more optimistic ones with a relatively higher alpha plus will converge more slowly. But the really interesting thing here is that in the case of, again, the variable distribution, it's not only now that they converge at different rates, but they actually converge to different asymptotic values. And the asymptotic values to which they converge can be, again, specified precisely as the so-called expectiles of the reward distribution. Expectiles generalize the mean of the distribution in the same way that quantiles generalize the median. Make that more precise for you if you want, but like, you could sort of think of them as a weighted mean, although that's not exactly what they are. That's sort of spiritually what they are. And we can index the degree of pessimism or optimism through this dimensionless parameter tau here, which is just the ratio of the positive learning rates to the sum of the positive and negative learning rates. And this gives us just an easy way to talk about more pessimistic or more optimistic value predictors. Okay. So this algorithm had been published previously and called expectile distributional reinforcement learning because the values that are learned here are the expectiles. If we go back to the neuroscience experiment, now that we have that background here, remember the broad idea here is that dopamine is conveying these teaching signals, also called for warp prediction errors, also abbreviated as delta, to the striatum, where they're going to be updating these value predictions that I call V sub I. And this would be like the standard expectile distribution RL story is perfectly consistent with this broad view of this dopamine striatal loop here. But a problem that this view runs into is that it treats the striatum as sort of one homogeneous block of value predictors, whereas we know that it is far more complicated than that. And in particular, although this is still an oversimplification, there are two primary classes of neurons in the striatum that are distinguished by expressing either the D1 type dopamine receptor or the D2 type dopamine receptor. And this is not just sort of like a random quirk of biology. Instead, these two cell types seem to be fundamentally different, or fundamentally opponent, I should say, in many respects. One example of this is that these D1 cells will tend to increase their synaptic strength in response to increases in dopamine above baseline. This vertical line here is baseline dopamine. And D2 neurons will tend to increase their synaptic strength in response to decreases in dopamine below baseline. These decreases in dopamine tend to follow worse than expected outcomes. The increases in dopamine tend to follow better than expected outcomes. So you might sort of intuitively guess that these D1 neurons will tend to converge to more optimistic values, whereas the D2s will converge to pessimistic values. And indeed, this is something that you can actually prove mathematically if we make certain assumptions about the function of this plasticity rule. That given a sufficient number of trials so let's say the variable odors, these D1 neurons are going to converge to this upper tail of the reward distribution, and these D2 neurons are going to converge to the lower tail of the reward distribution. Okay, so this is a model that is trying to retain.
Can you clarify the y-axis? So there you're saying activity, but in the parentheses you're saying VI. So is it VI decoded from the activity, or is it literally the activity?
Yeah, it's VI decoded from the activity, but the decoding is very dumb. It's the only difference between the activity and the VI is that the relationship is assumed to be positive in the case of D1 cells, and there's very good evidence that this is the case, and negative for D2 cells. And there is
when they're active, the VI goes down.
Correct. Right. And that's also part of the model, and that also that's another consequence of this plasticity rule, as well as an empirical observation, one that we verified in the course of this project, although I'm not going to show you those data. But the nice thing here, right, is that we have essentially these hypothetical value predictors that you would expect on the basis of this model that we're analogizing directly to the striatal neurons that we recorded in the previous experiment. And we can take those hypothetical value predictors and subject them to all the same analyses as we did our actual neurons. In this case, again, I'm focusing on PCA, but it goes beyond this. And you might think that you've seen this figure before. and you sort of did, but you saw it for data. Here's the model, and I hope that you can appreciate that it is quite indistinguishable, including both the separation of mean value along PC1, the separation of variance along PC2, and actually this even more surprising sort of finding that we didn't initially predict until we had formalized the model, which is that if you measure the distances along PC1 between a fixed odor and a nothing odor, and compare that to the distances along PC1 between a variable odor and a nothing odor, then these blue arrows are systematically longer, both in the model and in the data, which was a very interesting prediction of the model that we initially didn't expect, but that we were happy to see actually got borne out in data. So this was yet another indication in our view that we were sort of on the right track in terms of trying to relate this variant of an expectile distribution RL model to what's actually going on in this striatum.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
So yeah, there may be in the model you may have like many expectiles, but D1 and D2 is just two types.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, is there evidence that there's a range in the receptor expression of D1 and D2? Like, do some cells is there actually a continuum?
Yeah, so I also didn't go into this. It's in the paper. The continuum here, it arises not from like a range of receptor expression. I'm not aware of any such heterogeneity there. Instead, it arises from diversity in the dopamine neurons themselves. So Sarah, who's on this call, could tell you a lot more about that if you're curious. But essentially, we see, and we reported this back in 2020, that if you look at dopamine neuron responses as a function of reward magnitude, in some cases, it's just perfectly linear. But in some cases, there's a sort of kink where, below the expectation where you see dopamine dips, you'll see one slope in that response function. And then above this sort of so-called zero crossing point, we see a different slope. Those can be naturally interpreted in terms of the tau I that I introduced earlier here. And it is then possible to combine this diversity in dopamine tuning functions with this sort of dichotomy of D1, D2 neurons in the striatum and give rise to, again, this sort of spectrum of value predictors where that spectrum is subject to the sort of caveat that D1 neurons are going to be pulled in this optimistic direction systematically as a group, and the D2 neurons are going to be pulled pessimistically systematically as a group, and that's what gives rise to this sort of continuum. Okay. Is there another question here?
Oh yeah, I was going to ask about the asymmetry of the inhibitory and excitatory dopamine response, or dopamine difference response, and how that influences the learning rates and the convergence.
Okay, so did that previous answer that? So at the level of dopamine neurons, at the level of the receptors, or
at the level of the change in synaptic strength.
Okay, here, yes. Yeah, so maybe I have a supplementary slide where I actually have the full model, which I omitted for simplicity. No, I think I took it out. Essentially, what is going to happen? Oh, that's too bad that I removed. Okay, well, I believe it's figure 2 of the paper, so you can check. But essentially, the dopamine neurons have sort of one kind of piecewise linear function, and the plasticity rule, which is like just a fundamental, we think, like molecular property of the D1 or D2 receptors, we approximate as a different piecewise linear function, and then you're just talking about composing those two functions with one another to get the final output, right? And so they both contribute sort of equal parts to the ultimate tau, ultimate degree of optimism or pessimism, or degree of asymmetry that's learned by each neuron, and mathematically it just is a function composition.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Oh, let me get rid of this again. Okay, so if I were like maybe more sensible, I would just like have given you my like more complete, more thorough talk on this paper where things would be explained better and I would like show all these additional slides and everyone would come away feeling like, okay, they understood that. Since I'm too impatient and ambitious for that, I'll just say that like this paper is out. You can check it out with the QR code here. And instead, I want to talk about other broader things in this general world of RL in the brain. If anyone has any questions about the distributional RL paper, I would invite you to ask them now or later once we turn off recording. Cool. I'll just like add, there's a lot more data. We did many experiments. We did 2P imaging to selectively record from D1 and D2. We did optogenetics to selectively stimulate D1 and D2. We lesion dopamine to see what happens when you get rid of the teaching signal. There's lots of cool stuff there, but no time. Great. So let's now, let me just like summarize this part one of the talk, which again was like this potted history of like, many of the different threads of evidence for RL in the brain. So it's a powerful family of algorithms underlying many recent advances in machine learning, giving at least me some a priori reason to expect that these computational principles might generalize across substrates. To me, this is still like one of the most interesting hypotheses out there in the field of neuroscience and computational neuroscience. Okay. Secondly, I tried to show you that RL in the brain is not just a story about dopamine computing TD errors going back to Schultz 1997. Although I would say the evidence for dopamine computing TD errors at this point is diverse and overwhelming. It's much more than just this, simple classical conditioning experiment. I'm mentioning a few recent papers from the Uchida lab to this effect. And since Malcolm is on the call, and because Hadi called him out earlier about his like too good to be true results, if you're still around, Malcolm, and you have a few minutes, I'd love to just give you the opportunity to talk about this because I just think it's so cool. And more people should be aware of it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Adam. So this was part of our preprint. This is one of the main results, or perhaps the main result in our preprint that we just posted. And in that story, we tried to isolate dopamine-driven learning to see whether that's sufficient to drive signatures of TD learning, and if so, whether that can give us some insight into the mechanisms that produce the error signals. And there are several experiments in the paper before this that led us to focus on the D1 receptor expressing neurons specifically in the lateral nucleus accumbens. And so that led up to this point where we were hypothesizing that those neurons are representing something like a positive value signal. And we were asking whether the circuitry between those neurons and dopamine neurons is capable of calculating a TD error on its own. And before this project, I don't think we would have thought that would be the case. There's probably like a much more complicated thing going on. But we actually found that is the case in this experiment, and it was pretty striking. So what we did was we stimulated D1 MSNs optogenetically with these different temporal patterns that you can see in like the first column of B. The A is just showing the experimental prep where we're stimulating D1 neurons with red light, and we're also recording the striatal population activity with neuropixels at the same site, and we're recording dopamine release with a dopamine sensor at the same site. So that enables us to really characterize the transformation between D1 and dopamine release in a very precise way. So then we stimulated the D1 neurons with these different patterns that were designed to have a very specific prediction for what a TD error calculation would look like. So we have these different steps of stimulation with pulsatile stim for 1 second at 20 hertz, for 2 seconds at 20 hertz. I'm going down the column now from 1 through 7. An upward ramp, a downward ramp, and then these long steps of 5 hertz, 10 hertz, and 20 hertz. And then moving to the second column where it says the stimulation pattern smooth, that's just showing like the smooth version of those patterns. And then we can apply the TD error equation to those patterns to see like what would the response look like if there's a TD error computation built into this circuit. And you can see it basically looks like a derivative, but it actually differs from a derivative depending on the parameter of the TD equation, where the higher the discount, the more blue lines have a higher discount factor that is closer to 0. And And that becomes important for distinguishing a TD error computation specifically from a derivative. And then the data is in panel C where we could record the D1 MSN response with spiking with the NeuralPixel probe, and we found that whereas that data very closely followed the stimulation pattern, so there was no weird adaptation or anything going on. The dopamine response in the last column was almost exactly like the TD error of the D1 MSN activity. And that showed us that there is like some circuit between D1 MSNs and dopamine that is calculating the key step in TD learning, this TD error transformation.
One quick question. What's the state space? I guess my read of the dopamine literature is that the choice of the representation of the state space is kind of crucial to what patterns of.
Yeah, so this experiment gets around that on purpose because we're injecting in these different patterns directly into the D1. So there's no issue of state space.
Certainly for the experiment side, but for the model side.
I see. So the model side is just applying, you mean the simulation there?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're just applying like the instantaneous TD error equation of lambda v of t plus 1 minus v of t. And we then go on in the paper to characterize this transformation quantitatively, like with linear filtering. And we show that it's basically perfectly captured by a linear filter that has a positive part and a negative part. And we can show mathematically an equivalence between that and a TD equation. And then the time scale of that depends on other parameters of the linear filter, like how much it's smeared or smooth. Yeah, the dopamine is basically like a smeared out TD equation. Like you apply the TD equation and then you smear it out with an additional filter. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, I think this result is like really cool. If you're like a theorist and you're wondering, oh, like I guess everyone like plays in particular like temporal patterns of optogenetic stimulation and records for them. Like, no, nobody does this. For most people, like optogenetics is like a switch to say like, we banged on the neuron hard or we didn't. And so like this degree of temporal resolution and like taking a temporal derivative, I think is just like extraordinarily beautiful and to me quite convincing. And that's what I mean by like we're not stuck in a Schultz 1997 world. There's like lots of really beautiful results of this nature to show that.
So can you explain what is a high level interpretation, like takeaway message? Is this fair to say that result was that the circuits in the striatum, basal ganglia are just like designed to compute this error? Is it just hard coded in the architecture? Is that the way to read this, or?
That's really my reading. Go.
That's how I read it. Yeah.
Okay.
Like to something Adam said earlier, like there's a lot of other learning processes, unsupervised learning and reward independent learning going on in the brain. But it seems as though this particular pathway is hard coded to perform a TD error algorithm on top of what it receives.
Right. So much so that you can play in, completely artificial simulation patterns, and it still does the thing that it's meant to do, which is take a derivative of value signal, which resides in the D1, or the positive version of the value signal, which resides in D1. Beautiful. Yeah, I think it's cool. Okay, other findings that are nice to be aware of if you're someone who's sort of adjacent to this literature. There are a few quite nice experiments that show that dopamine plays the correct causal role in terms of motivating behavior in ways that are quantitatively predicted by TD error specifically, and that you would not necessarily just get by a general, I feel positive when I go to this side of the arena and because I'm getting dopamine stimulation. Instead, you can make, again, much more quantitative predictions at the level of behavior. This is true for both positive and negative TD errors, which is to say, activating dopamine neurons. And what I actually spent time telling you is that the principal downstream target of dopamine neurons, namely the striatum, covariates with reward predictions in the manner predicted by distributional RL. Okay. And the last thing, right, is that RL provides a normative explanation for empirically observed plasticity rules in the striatum. And so I didn't really go into this, but the D2 plasticity rule that I mentioned as kind of like this mirror image of the D1, that was people sort of had hypothesized something to this effect for a long time. It was really first precisely measured in 2020, 2021, roughly, and then sort of stuck out like a sore thumb in the RL literature because we didn't have a great idea as to what this kind of like mirror image plasticity rule was doing. And one of the core contributions of my paper was to show actually there is a normative explanation for this weird between D2 plasticity rule and it emerges from distributional RL and it fits a lot of data in the striatum. So all of these things I think we get by taking RL seriously and in like to some degree literally as a model of what the basal ganglia are doing.
One question. At what timescales do you think this kind of the evidence is suggesting the system is working?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, and that could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Like there's like the time scale of like the linear filter that like Malcolm was alluding to. That's like sort of one time scale. I think that it is almost certainly a hierarchy of timescales. That, by the way, there, in case you're wondering, there are rigorous computational frameworks for how to do RL at a series of timescales. If you think about something like hierarchical RL or the options framework.
Is this related to multiple discount factors, or is it?
And then there's also
Okay.
and then there's also the multiple discount factor thing from Paul Massey in the lab, who's now a professor at McGill, showing that there's a diversity of temporal discounts across individual dopamine neurons recorded simultaneously. So I don't think there's a single time scale. And then there's different systems in the brain, striatum, cortex, et cetera, that all plug in with their own time scales. There's things like meta reinforcement learning, where maybe the cortex is sort of able to emulate an RL algorithm sort of autonomously without the influence of dopamine, just purely based off of neural dynamics. So many timescales. Important timescales to be aware of, I would say, are like the intrinsic dynamics of dopamine neurons in the context of like what Malcolm presented, as well as the intrinsic dynamics of the plasticity rules, which generally I would say are probably time scale of like minutes to hours, at least as best as we can measure them, mostly in slice and to some degree by like doing like flume photometry of like cyclic AMP or other messenger molecules. Yeah.
Yeah, this was mentioned earlier, but did you guys happen to dive deeper into how there was like an overrepresentation of sensation in the striatum?
Oh yeah.
And, like if that would like increase the representational capacity of the system? Or
yeah, that's a
you
great.
guys measured the representational capacity of like.
Yes, that's a great question. We did dive a little bit deeper into it. So initially in the first data set, we just showed that there are 6 different odors here. You show that you can decode odors pretty well, particularly during the odor period. Let's say it's like, I don't know, 80% decoding accuracy in the 6-way decoder with balanced accuracy. So chance is 1/6. And so like that's fine. But what's really cool is when we lesioned dopamine, and we did this by injecting a neurotoxin called 6-OHDA unilaterally into one hemisphere of the brain. So the other hemisphere acts as an internal control for that exact animal, which is smelling the same odor, whatever, experiencing the same pattern of rewards. And then we just compared the neural decoding matched for like numbers of neurons or whatever between the lesion hemisphere and the control hemisphere. We find that we can better decode the odor in the control hemisphere that has had access to dopamine input rather than the lesion hemisphere, which is deprived of direct dopamine input. So that's an interesting empirical finding in its own right. But it is also, in some sense, you kind of have to like squint your eyes a little bit, but in some sense predicted by the theory of distributional RL. Because, so why does distributional RL work to improve performance in deep RL systems? It doesn't have anything to do with the sort of choice rule at decision time, because the way in general that these things work, unless maybe Tom is doing something funkier with like actual risk-sensitive decision rules, but generally you do all this work to learn this value distribution, and then you just pick the action that maximizes the expected value. You're acting this purely risk-neutral way. So the only way, even in principle, that distributional RL could help your performance is if it is allowing you to learn something like better state representations earlier on in the network. This DRL system, you need to propagate lots of information to learn these good representations that will be useful. And this distributional RL objective sort of gives you like auxiliary tasks that you can use to learn and get more information through the network. And if that's the case, then you might predict that you get something like better decoding of these state inputs, and that seems to be what you get. So that's kind of nifty.
You say better decode from the control hemisphere than the lesion hemisphere. So how accurately can you decode just from the lesion hemisphere?
I'd have to go and check. This is, I believe, figure 3 paper, but it is, I want to say it's a difference of like 10 or 20%. Yeah, so it's like pretty sizable.
Okay. And how well are you able to decode it within the control hemisphere?
Like approximately 80% for us for a 6-way decoder.
Cool.
Oh, hey, Julie.
Yeah, sorry, I have one other question regarding maybe, I mean, the timing of your experiments in itself. And I'm wondering, whenever you're looking like doing these models of the behavior of like all the neurons at the same time of responses, so which regime are you in terms of behavior? I'm wondering, like, does that model works right from the start of like the mice learning the task, or is that something that can only kicks in after a certain number of trials when the mice is in this regular regime? So can you speak a little bit for that to that?
Great, it's a great question. Yeah, so in these experiments, everything was in expert mice. So we're like in the sort of asymptotic range. We're assuming slash inferring on the basis of the animals flicking and other behavior that they've accurately learned at the very least the expected value of the distributions, and then we're inferring from the neural activity that they've learned more than just the expected value of the distributions. So that's all we have data for right now is the expert asymptotic case. In terms of how this would affect learning, there are all kinds of interesting predictions that you can make. Different people in the lab and other labs have, more like reversal learning paradigms where you can imagine, now that the animal sort of knows the rules of the game and knows to expect there to be water, it's, at some timing, and there's all these other, conceptual things that they learn. Now you can start fitting more complicated models. In fact, I heard yesterday at Cortex Club here that that you can have a risk sensitive RL model that better predicts a monkey's choices over the course of like a similar task with sort of drifting reward values. That a risk sensitive model is better than like a traditional RL or risk neutral model in terms of predicting these choices. So there's definitely cases where playing around with the relative positive and negative learning rates allow you to better predict behavior as the behavior is evolving and as the animal is learning. The one tricky thing about distributional RL, and this is I think often misunderstood, right, is so we had risk sensitive RL before we had distributional RL, which is to say people realized that you could play around with a single positive learning rate and a single negative learning rate and get these sort of bias convergence properties. Distributional RL is distinguished by the fact that it has like this whole family of value predictors and it's simultaneously estimating the whole distribution. And so to turn that distributional estimate into like an action, you need some kind of rule for collapsing across the distribution. In general, this rule is take mean. That need not be the only rule you could pick. You could pick an arbitrary percentile, an arbitrary expectile. You could essentially, once you have the distribution, you can compute arbitrary functionals of that distribution. But that extra degree of flexibility makes asking these questions on the basis of behavior alone, particularly during learning, especially fraught. That's what I would say. Does that make sense?
Right. So it means we don't have access to that, basically. That's what you're answering.
Yes, we don't. We can't. We don't have unambiguous access to the decision rule on the basis of the distribution, and often it's easiest to just assume that they're computing expected value because that seems like the most principled thing to do, and that's what's done in machine learning.
So, you could have a task though that is built up in a sense where you can still test. I'm thinking, okay, not here you are taking, I guess, arbitrary orders is something you've not discussed, but you're probably using errors that are not having any values in the first place.
Correct.
And then through the task, it is attributed values. But you could also train mice into orders that already have values, like orders of food versus orders of like, aggressive mice or something like that. So like play on the hedonicity of the orders themselves to then manipulate that in your tasks so that they already have values in themselves, and so you wouldn't have this to reach this asymptotic behavior from the start.
Yeah, and so people have done this. So you can show, for example, that odors that naturally give rise to positive dopamine transients are like easier to learn to associate with value in some sense, or that they're learned faster. So these kinds of effects exist. We were like trying to like limit that. But like the broader point that like, mice are not, arbitrary learners capable of learning arbitrary associations, is well taken. That is like definitely an idealization of, but we pick our odors, as you alluded to, intentionally to try to approximate that case as much as possible. And the hope is that, that this gives us a window onto the kinds of natural behaviors that are more relevant for the animal survival, but that are inherently more difficult to study and more difficult to formalize.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Leonard.
Hi, thank you. I was thinking about what this means in terms of like situations where like advantage is sort of multiplicative, like in a game of chess, I'd say. You sort of have this capital to work with, and advantages snowball. And if you have this sort of distribution over outcomes, I'm wondering how that plays into like optimal decision rules there.
Yeah, so it's sort of like a question about like temporal dependencies, sort of, and temporal correlations. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were like played around for a long time with like how to design a neuroscience task to like really get at this in a way, again, that like lends itself to formalization. And this is relevant not just to distributional RL in this sort of like reward magnitude setting, but also in this temporal setting that I alluded to with different discounts across dopamine neurons. In general, I'd say we don't have awesome neuro evidence to this effect yet. What we do have is like the way these algorithms are actually implemented in silico. And there, if you think about something like the Atari games, it's like, absolutely the case that you have these long range temporal dependencies. And distributional RL helps you learn those a lot. And in particular, like you might have cases where like, if I take some action, then, there's a a chance that I like, like a good chance that I do like reasonably well, but then there's like a small chance of catastrophe, like I like lose my life in whatever Space Invaders. And that might be, the kind of thing that is super useful for a learning system to have access to. In particular, it might be the case that given this distribution, that that the expected value of that distribution is identical to the expected value of a state with a much more unimodal, like, well-behaved distribution of outcomes. And it's really important for the learning system to be able to distinguish between those states, particularly given these long-range temporal dependencies between, well, if I go over here, that means I'm probably not going over there, which means I'm going to be vulnerable to whatever, right? And so, I think, this is sort of just a corollary of it improving performance a lot. A lot of the way in which it improves performance on these hard RL domains where there are these long-range temporal dependencies is by better sort of learning and modeling those dependencies.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So that's part one. I promise part one is the longest part. So it's all hope is not lost. But if we have to trim some of part three, that's why it's part three. All right. Part two, everything, everywhere, all at once. Okay, so you will often hear that the brain is a prediction machine. I think that's like a particular favorite one-liner of like this journal club. So shout out Hadi. That does not make all of the brain an RL machine. I believe that different forms of predictive coding may operate on different attributes and different temporal scales. To allude to Michael's question, so for example, the ventral visual stream might be predicting the next image in a sequence or fill in details given some local context, or otherwise implement some kind of generative model. Eli talked about this a little bit in his talk during this series. The cerebellum might be predicting consequences of fine motor adjustments and timing. Hippocampus may predict the next state in some abstract state space. This may or may not be relevant to predicting downstream rewards. All of these are examples of predictive coding. All of them, make use of this, Helmholtzian idea of the brain as a prediction machine. But they are all different from, VTA dopamine and the basal ganglia caring about reward, and specifically reward. And predictions about reward, I think, are importantly different from predictions about all the other things that one might want to make a prediction about. Yeah, Eli, what's up? Did I not do justice?
Hey, so I appreciate your citing, you're citing my paper, whichever paper that actually is. I guess that's the oscillations one.
It was the one that you referred to in your talk. Yeah, I don't remember.
Okay, yeah, then that would have been the oscillations. But anyway, but I do think we should let's be careful with our language here. There's at least two different hypotheses regarding how the cortex could be implementing some kind of generative model. One of which is predictive coding, which really ought to be called prediction error coding. It says that afferent or reafferent evoked activity is going to be larger for errors because there's more spiking necessary to correct the representations when when the prediction representations are wrong. And that one is actually not so well supported by the empirical evidence.
Agreed.
What tends to be better supported is what we could call predictive information coding or predictive representation coding, where the neurons tune themselves to sort of pick up on information that's predictive about the near future, on the time scale of that area.
It's true.
Is the first thing that he said about it not being super well predicted that
Generally, I mean, like, for example, how do you think of like the oddball effect cortex? Where you have something which is very, very predictable, like a tone at 50 hertz, but then if you have like an oddball tone at 60 hertz, that is actually what elicits the strongest response.
Yeah, I know Eli has strong opinions about the oddball effect.
Sorry, I mean, I did 2 years of work analyzing this, right? And the old-fashioned oddball effect is as far as we can tell, it's a release from local adaptation in the sensory neurons themselves, or that is the sensory cortical neurons. If you try to create an oddball that relies entirely on contextual knowledge and does not have any actual change detection, in the raw stimulus, then you don't get the so-called oddball effect. That was what we showed these past couple of years.
And I would also, just to shout out my own work, I wrote a perspective on a paper from from Sonia Hofer and Tomarsek Flogel's lab last year, I think in biology, that reviews a very interesting experiment that they did, sort of similar to this in terms of, we're talking about visual cortex and visual predictions, but it's like at a slightly more abstract temporal scale. And they, did really nice experiments where, you can, record from layer 2, 3 cells, which are the exact cells that you were predicting, are carrying forward these, these prediction errors in, these particular models put forward by like Friston and Rao and others. And, they show essentially very different results than you would predict, at least from sort of the most straightforward interpretation of those models. They're not always super transparent. So I think I think I share the conclusion that like there's the cortex is making predictions in some way. This seems to be important to how it works, but the precise nature of the predictive signals and which cells carry which signals and how the circuit comes together to perform this computation, I think is entirely not understood at the moment.
And
Yeah, I want us to be sort of careful and ecumenical with our language, because there's a tendency to say, if you are studying the cortical implementation of perceptual inference or prediction, then you are studying quote unquote predictive coding, and that effectively allocates all the scientific credit to exactly the set of models that are starting to be refuted. When there's a whole nother set of models and a whole other set of experimental evidence that is really coming into play right now.
Yeah, just on that note, I just wanted to add, maybe like ask Adam if there's maybe a deeper level of abstraction to interpret your results, and kind of because what you've observed is an empirical fact. But I talked to you about this at the neuroscience retreat, so I want to just mention it again because other people have the same idea. So what if we just declare that, following from Barlow, Olshausen, Simoncelli, that the brain adapts to the statistics of its environment, and some of the aspects of environment, like reward, are very important, and you have to also adapt to those statistics particularly. And what you found is a neural mechanism, how it's implemented. Straight. Is that a fair interpretation, or do you think that's different story.
There's a level on which I think that I think that's totally fair. Yeah, the reward is one. There's certain statistics around the delivery of reward. One thing that the brain is learning among many things. However, I think reward is also special. So like I don't think that like there's a difference between reward and like the distribution of visual contrast in the environment with all respect to Marlowe. Those are both important questions. But reward is like specifically useful for guiding behavior in specific contexts. This is why like RL centers around reward and the value function. Now, it is also true that there are things like generalized value functions and lots of other and successor features and like lots of other things that end up empirically being useful in RL. If they're RL aficionados, they'll like be nodding their heads maybe. But just because those things exist does not mean that we like have fully replaced the value function and its central purpose, its central role in our own. So I do think that there is a meaningful difference still to be, even though yes, on some level of abstraction, they're the same fundamental things that are operating on different units. And now the other important thing there is that seems at least like different parts of the brain concern themselves with these different inputs. And it like very much seems to be the case that the basal ganglia and dopamine care about reward in a way that other aspects of the brain don't, notwithstanding the somewhat interesting puzzling fact that frontal cortex and retrosplenial cortex and maybe even hippocampus and all these places also seem to care about value. And that's another conversation maybe for another time.
Yeah, I'm curious how you incorporate like the I guess last leg of the RL journey of just so you have this representation of a value function, and then you also have this incredibly high dimensional action space. And how do you wind up projecting all the way down into that so that you can actually, especially across timescales and compositionality and whatnot, within all of the many actions an animal can take.
Right. So to boil down the question, you're saying like where does action come into the picture? Basically,
it's more like but in a biophysical setting specifically, like where does you kind of say like we can find these representations of value function, and I understand that, but then like saying okay, there's value functions in the brain would also mean that there has to be some circuit which is doing that argmax or whatever.
Yes. Can I ask you to hold off until the end of the talk because I'm going to address that very specifically. And if I don't do it, you can yell at me and maybe. But yes, that is coming.
Sounds good.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So basically, lots of the brain is doing prediction. That's different from it doing prediction about reward or about doing RL. That's one important caveat. Another issue is whether the brain is doing end-to-end RL. Essentially, maybe the paradigm case of end-to-end reinforcement learning again is this deep Q network, which is taking in stacks of frames, where essentially it's getting pixel values and putting them through a deep convolutional neural network and ultimately outputting Q values at the end here. So values associated with each action or action combinations of that frame. And it is just initialized randomly and it's learning purely from gameplay on these pixels. And it's pretty amazing that this works. This was like a major achievement 10 years ago. But is it a strong hypothesis about what the brain is doing? I would say absolutely not. And this is maybe obvious, but first of all, the brain evolved, so it comes pre-configured with lots of useful machinery and representations. It doesn't just get randomly initialized by some like Gaussian or whatever. And the brain also has access to a richly varied stream of experience from which it can learn in the absence of reward. So this is where supervised and unsupervised or self-supervised learning all come in. These are all very much part of the picture. I am absolutely not rejecting or diminishing any of these things. By the way, these two features of actual learning in the brain are super convenient because it helps solve a whole host of challenges that accompany RL. So people will talk about sample inefficiency. They'll talk about the sparse reward problem. And yeah, those are real problems. They're like real problems when it comes to how you make your deep neural network learn from sort of reasonable amounts of experience. But those are not the same problems that are faced by biological organisms, and we have good reason to think that they have other ways of solving them. And indeed, I think like I've actually been like really struck by by the last few years of progress in large language models and the fact that like this general paradigm of you do a massive pre-training run on like all the data on the internet that you can possibly scrape, and you're just doing next word prediction in an entirely self-supervised way, and this gives you some kind of foundation model, and then you put this foundation model through a bunch of reinforcement learning, whether that's RL from human feedback or RL from verifiable rewards most recently. And that RL pipeline allows you to leverage this like massive pre-existing body of knowledge and channel it to being really, really good at performing specific tasks. Obviously, like this is not a direct analogy to the brain, but in some sense, evolution is like some massive pre-training data set that gives you a ton of useful priors, a ton of useful representations. Then you actually get born into the world. And there are like particular problems that you need to solve that might be unique to your environment, or that might be dynamic and changing over the course of your lifetime. And you can essentially leverage this pre-training to do much more efficient, much more effective RL that is not end-to-end. And like this is a feature, not a bug of how the whole thing is meant to work. I think that is like actually an extremely like good exhibit of how RL might actually work in practice. And last thing I just will like throw out there, because it's important and also awkward for me, is that we don't yet know a good way to backpropagate through all those layers in the brain. And so local learning signal will probably require getting back like the LTP point. So basically we couldn't do end-to-end RL even if we wanted to, because we want to know how to get the reward signal back to like early layers of the network. There are certain ways in which reinforcement can help with this. So reinforce is an example of like a way to get a sort of local-ish learning rule, but it can't solve the problem of gradients, so it can't fundamentally solve the problem of like learning in these high-dimensional spaces. Okay, now, sorry that like, as you can tell, this part of the talk is just like turning into like things that I think are interesting and useful and underappreciated, but not necessarily super coherent. So apologies, let me know if this is going to be too confusing. Getting back to, I think, one of Anne's questions from earlier, so like, but very much related to this problem of like end-to-end reinforcement or not, right? So these sort of state representations have to come from somewhere. I just told you that I don't think that they are learned in end-to-end fashion. So like, where do I think that they come from? Well, in general, like we deal with this in neuroscience by offloading these representations to the cortex, because the cortex is this amazing prediction machine that is learning all kinds of useful representations, often in unsupervised or self-supervised fashion. This means that state sort of operates like the dark matter of RL, because we know it must be there, but it's very difficult to observe directly. There's so much going on in cortex. Any part of it could be getting input to the RL machinery or not. I do think that this is a fair criticism that one can have of RL models in the brain. Maybe they're unconstrained, something like this. But what I want to push back on is that like state is like somehow like fundamentally mysterious, because I don't think that is true. I think that you have some inputs, and state is just some function of those inputs. And in that sense, these like deep RL systems can actually be a useful technology. And the other thing is, I think that neuroscientists are beginning to realize that like so-called hidden state factors like arousal or attention or imprints are not only sort of like relevant for predicting neural activity, but often even come to dominate neural activity, even in places where you might not expect, like visual cortex or whatever. And there are some generalizations of RL, such as partially observable Markov distributed processes that operate on so-called belief states that accommodate this fact, I think, quite nicely. So maybe the summary of this slide is state like still mysterious, but like tractably so, and not a reason why we should like discard. No problem. Thanks for coming in. Why we should discard these models entirely. And just as state need not be mysterious, I think reward need not be mysterious. And I can already see Hadi get like chewing his teeth or something. All right, so here are some things that are true about reward. So first of all, N will satiate, and so that means that rewards are non-stationary. If I'm really thirsty, water is going to be rewarding. As if I just drank a whole bottle of water, it's not going to be so rewarding anymore. Okay. Rewards must be in some sense inferred, in like the trivial sense that like everything must be inferred, because like our brain is like a dark box, right? Okay, and reward can also be either low level in terms of like these core physiological or homeostatic needs, or high level. What are some examples of high level rewards? Well, you can imagine social rewards if you've been deprived of socialization. Interestingly, and I don't think this is nearly widely appreciated enough, but if you record from dopamine neurons in a mouse, and that mouse goes from being isolated to being social, you generally see increases in RPE firing during these interaction periods. That's what I'm showing you on the right here. I believe the top panel is a single neuron, and this middle panel F here is is the average across neurons, and you see it like a pronounced tendency for dopamine neurons to fire during the interaction blocks. And you can also interestingly see how that sort of tapers off once you've gotten enough interaction over the course of, in this case, this is, tens of minutes to an hour, that tends to taper off in the way that you might expect for like social rewards. This is also true. I love this literature of performance errors in songbirds that like Vikram Gadekar has been mainly pioneering. So, for example, if you take a juvenile songbird that is practicing its song, these are zebra finches, and you do a playback experiment where you distort the syllable away from what you assume the bird was intending to do, you tend to see dips in dopamine firing, whereas if you leave it undistorted and sort of the correct syllable, you see increases in VTA dopamine neuron firing above baseline. Even if this is now from a different paper where we're not talking about distortions, but you're tracking the same bird over many days or months, and you're just asking, in the juvenile songbird, whether a certain syllable was either closer to the ultimate song that it would develop into as an adult, that's in blue, or further away from the song. So it's like, it's whatever, it's going in the wrong direction. You again see, in this case, you have a fluorescent sensor for dopamine, and you see, these prediction errors going in the exact same way. So, here we have, I think, two really nice examples of something that is like more abstract than just did I get water in the last second? And nonetheless, dopamine is tracking these things in exactly the way that you would expect.
So thanks for having this slide, because I think this is probably my biggest challenge for me to embrace RL, is that in the famous diagram, there's this reward coming from the environment and going to the agent, but you're saying that the rewards are non-stationary, which means they're context dependent, and they're also inferred. So they should be computed inside the agent. And so therefore, is this like a valid criticism of the standard Sutton and Bartow view, or is this a straw man? I want to understand that part, because to me, it seems like it's just wrong.
So I would say, so the agent knows everything that the agent needs to know in order to say whether reward is in fact rewarding at a given time. So the agent knows if it's hungry, it knows if it's thirsty, it knows if it's socially deprived, it knows if it's trying to sound a C and it gives a C sharp or whatever, right? It knows all of these things. And somehow, and I agree that we don't know exactly how this happens. Somehow all that information eventually makes its way to dopamine neurons, because there's very good evidence that dopamine neurons across all of these classes of potential rewards knows what is better than expected and knows what is worse than expected and changes its firing in the way that you would predict. That I agree is a highly non-trivial computation. It's not as simple as reward gets input to the agent. But I don't think it's a fundamental limitation in terms of applying the RL theory, because at some point there's like whatever putative reward, then some black box thing, and then at the level. But when it finally comes out of the dopamine neurons, there's actually a reward here, and the agent is trying to maximize that thing, and it has the information necessary to do that. And I guess if you someone could in principle study all the things that all the processing, all the state dependent things. Arguably, this is what a lot of hypothalamus people are doing when it comes to how are you quenching AGRP neurons for hunger or things like this, and that those are interesting. I choose to pick up the story when you have done whatever the processing to get a nice pure reward that is going to either cause dopamine neurons to increase or decrease. And for my purposes, dopamine just is the readout of what is rewarding to an animal at a given time. And that's why you also see quenching, for example, with satiety. You don't think these dopamine neuron responses will tend to run down.
So you're taking this implementation view as more fundamental than the normative reward. So you're saying whatever I see, whenever the dopamine neurons are active, that is what reward is to me.
100%.
Okay. Yes. Right.
Adam.
Yes.
Just one question. So the examples you gave, including your very beautiful work and others, which is task-based, right? So you have a clear reward you will be striving to. In the case of the songbird, it's a more ethological setting, but it's still a very, very, very specific setting, which may not represent real world, where basically I need to, the zebrafin specifically, not even all songbirds, but the zebrafin specifically, I want to optimize this one specific song, right? But in real life, for many animals, most animals, I would say, the world landscape is very unpredictable, right? And so learning it in the same way as you would learn a task in a lab is in many cases just like, useless, right? Because you will be learning something that may not be relevant, 10 minutes after and a day after.
Well, so
my question was like,
let's table that last point for a little bit.
Okay.
So I don't think it's useless, but
Before you
said the reason why I planted you in the audience to ask that exact question at this exact time is because I think that even in unstructured tasks, we have very good evidence that dopamine is structuring action selection on a moment by moment basis. So this is a paper from the lab. Jeff Markowitz is the first author here, and here they were using MoSeq, which is essentially like a behavioral classification pipeline to identify in real time the so-called syllables, essentially like small components of actions that animals are doing completely spontaneously, completely unstructured in a like dark plastic bucket, basically with no rewards anywhere. They're using MoSeq and they're doing it in real time, so that if the animal does some syllable, which they select, I think, like arbitrarily out of like a list of whatever 40 syllables, they can give closed loop optogenetic feedback and stimulate, in this case, SNC dopamine neurons projecting to the dorsal striatum. When they do this, again, we're talking now not in the case of a task, not in the case of any trained behavior, completely unstructured behavior, they see that the target syllable that they are stimulating tends to be used a lot more, whether you do, and no matter how you quantify that, it's a pretty strong effect. So I think that very good evidence that that this sort of dopamine-based reinforcement mechanism can operate over unstructured tasks in the absence of explicit reward.
I think this is very similar, like a structured task. Why is it different?
Well, at the very least, it's not trial-based. There's no explicit rewards in the environment other than dopamine. It's operating in terms of like the animal's own actions, and like there's no other sort of environmental contingencies.
But the behavior of the animal itself is structured inherently in many cases. It's like in mice, the way many patterns of their movement, and also in us humans, are very well structured. And then you're giving reward to one very specific thing. I'm saying like real behavior is typically not that.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think that like it's not structured over very short time scales. I think that like again, we have a hierarchy of time scales, and how this gets encoded is very interesting, and how this gets encoded for a non-human animal. All right, let's imagine a bat. What does a bat need to do, right? A bat needs to like go out every night and forage and get food, which means that like at this particular hour it needs to fly to some destination location. Okay, so that's like a kind of reward or goal that it might have over the time scale of like minutes to hours. Then it gets to its foraging location, and now it needs to find food. That is rewards that are cropping up on a time scale of seconds to minutes. And then it needs to maybe go to like a different foraging location or whatever. Sure, there's like I guess there's some sense in which like yeah, it's much broader than whatever trying to complete the next trial and do the poke left and then get a reward. But in another sense, like I think the entire like what is foraging if not like a series of intermittent rewards that like might be sparse that require like goal directed behavior over the course of like relatively potentially long time scales that animals have to go through like on a daily basis.
I'm a bit confused by when you say that like there's no explicit reward in the environment, because how could we know that just because we didn't give them a sweet drink that they were not rewarded by something in the environment?
Sorry, in the case of this last task, or in case of the example that I just gave?
No, what you were talking about, the study where you're saying that there's no explicit reward.
There's no explicit reward.
It's only explicit to us because we put it there. There could just as well be other reward.
Sure. I mean, in this case, if they're like randomly picking a syllable to stimulate, and then they can show that it's that specific syllable that's getting upregulated in terms of its usage, then like that is like a pure experimental manipulation. That is like that we are dialing in as the experimenter, as opposed to like something that is intrinsic.
Yeah.
Did that answer?
I'm not sure I understand the premise then, because I'm thinking that if you have I guess the lack of reward is almost like unfalsifiable.
I think he's going at like the hard problem of subjectivity. Maybe some mice just find the color of the shirt of the experimenter rewarding. No.
Well, there's things like there's a lot of things which I wouldn't consider goal directing that I find rewarding. Like if I look up and I happen to see a leaf that is particularly beautiful, I like enjoy that even though it's completely like it wasn't put there by an experimenter. I mean, I could enjoy the fact that my knuckles cracking was satisfying. Like it's not a
Yeah, so there can be intrinsic rewards. This often happens to work in RL settings. We don't get to choose those things as the experimenter. I can't say that we're excluding that when we like drop a mouse into a featureless
I
dark.
guess that's what was.
That's been like wiped out with ethanol, so they're like no. But like maybe there are certain, but whatever that is, that's not explaining the fact that when you simulate on a given.
Maybe like there's like group average that averages those things
Yeah,
out.
probably.
Across
And there are like, look, there are spontaneous dopamine fluctuations, and like those things, like we just won't know as the experimenters without access to their consciousness. Yeah.
You may have said this too, but it seems like if the animal's making a, whatever it's vocalizing or something, then an obvious rewarding thing is, or lack of reward is if the sound is not what it expects, right? So it's just a matter of control.
Yeah.
So I assume that's what's going on in this experiment, that you do this manipulation and then the interpretation by the brain is, oh, I must not have made the sound I expected to make. I've got a problem with my motor control. I need to make some adjustments. Right. That's what I'm assuming that's tapping into.
Yeah, I mean, I should have. Yeah, so there is this kind of like motor control, motor predictive loop. I should have mentioned in this case, so they have like stimulation sessions where they're actively delivering the dopamine stim, and then they're actually quantifying this change the session after. So it's like not just a real-time effect of, in the sense of like the same intracranial self-stimulation. Ooh, that made me feel good, and let me do it again, like the lever press. Instead, it's like actually structuring the animal's like action selection over at least slightly longer time scales. So I agree with the thing that you said, but I think it does also go beyond that to like, there's the longer term learning. Okay, in the interest of time, I want to move on to chapter 3. I'll just say that, like, again, going back to Adi's question, like usually evolution knows what counts as a reward and does a good job of telling us what should be rewarded, and that machinery is like deeply integrated into the brain. And in cases where that goes haywire, you get some kind of addiction or something bad. All right. I couldn't resist this title, Beyond Chat. So maybe some of you already know what I'm referring to. It sounds cryptic, but it's not. This is the table of contents of Sun and Bartow 2018, the sort of Bible of reinforcement learning. And you like start reading through it, and it's pretty good. Okay, it's like well written. And then you hit like chapter 6, and it's temporal difference. Like, look at all this good stuff here. It's temporal difference learning, optimality of T0. We got SARSA, we have Q learning. And like, if you're not careful, you might get like so excited, you might say, oh my God, this answers all the questions that I had to like model my RL, my neuroscience experiment. And then you like just put the book to the side, you start doing all this modeling, and then you forget to come back to it. And then you make the mistake of thinking that this is what RL is. But the amazing thing about books is that often there are more than 6 chapters. And so here's the table of contents of chapters 7 through 15. And if you flip this far, you'll see lots of other really great stuff. Things like planning and learning, very much part of core RL, as well as policy gradient methods, chapter 13, which for my money is my favorite chapter in this book. But yeah, that's just me. Okay, so what can we learn when we go beyond chapter 6? I actually don't want to spend, since we're like running out of time, I just want to say that like there's this thing, it's called model-based RL. It's often quite useful. It's the way, a lot of state-of-the-art algorithms like, for example, AlphaGo work. And generally model-based and model-free. Up to now, we've basically been talking about model-free. These are more or less 2 ends of a continuum. There are certain frameworks like Dyna, which sort of smoothly interpolate between these 2 things, where you can either, use real experience to do this direct RL update using TD errors, or you can use that to train a model of the environment that you can sample from, and then you can use that simulated experience to update your policy and your value function in the exact same way. There is some really lovely evidence from neuroscience that, at least in certain cases, humans and non-human animals use this more model-based update. I don't have time to like go over this, but you can check it out if you want. There's also very interesting potential neural correlates of this kind of simulation or sampling from a model of the environment in the form of reverse replay, and forward replay. Again, if I had time, I would talk about all these things. Happy to take questions. I am deliberately not explaining this, but if you're like a more theoretical person who isn't deeply immersed in the neuroscience literature here, these are papers that you might want to check out. Also, data sweeps more recently existing in hippocampus as well as like entorhinal cortex. All of these things are at least possible, and emphasis on possible because there are many other explanations for what these physiological signatures are doing, but they are possible neural substrates for planning and simulation. If you wanted to have a model-based RL algorithm working, these are the kinds of things that you might expect to see in the brain to do that kind of simulation. Yeah, that was a very, very quick gloss because I promised you that I'd get to this last part. Again, I think that more computational people are maybe more familiar with / comfortable with the last thing that I want to talk about, which is policy gradient methods. But this is like a constant frustration of mine within the neuroscience of RL, and it's my talk, so I get to do what I want. Okay. So, the broad goal of reinforcement learning is to act in a way that maximizes expected return, which we often call value. So you might think that the only way that we can do this is by learning the expected return that comes with each possible action, and then choosing the action with the highest expected value, which is like the argmax over actions. This is what's done in for example, Q-learning. But it is not the only way. There is a whole other class of algorithms called policy gradient methods, which directly parameterize the policy. The policy is just the probability distribution over actions. The semantics of the policy are completely different than the semantics of the action value function. Probability, the policy, because it's a probability, for example, has to sum to 1, has to be positive, which is it has to be non-negative. Whereas the value function or the action value function is the expected discounted sum of future returns. So the semantics are entirely different. And it is often easier or better or more convenient in practice to simply take some scalar performance measure, which we'll often call J. This is something like the average reward rate, and then do gradient ascent on that performance measure, where you are optimizing the parameters, for example, of your policy directly to increase this measure. Probably the most fundamental theoretical result in all of reinforcement learning is the policy gradient theorem, which gives you a way to do this. Basically, it says, when you take some action A here that got a really good return, the return here is G, you want to increase the chance of doing that action again, but you're gonna normalize this to the probability with which you selected that action. So if you took a good action, but your probability was already extremely high, well, you don't need to update your parameters that much. But if you took a rare action and the payoff is really high, well, now you want to update your parameters a lot. That's the sort of intuition behind this result, but it's a theorem. You can look up the proof. It's in chapter 13, and it gives rise to all these wonderful properties. Like you can directly learn optimal stochastic or deterministic policies. Imagine rock paper scissors, for example. Optimal policy is a third, a third, a third. If you just have if you use Q-learning for this and your decision rules in argmax over actions, you're never going to actually be able to approximate the optimal mixture of actions. And there might be many such things in a world of multiple interacting agents where randomization is important. Like this, it extends nicely to continuous action spaces, to high dimensional action spaces. You can shape inject prior knowledge into the policy, and you get all these nice theoretical guarantees, because unlike this argmax thing where there's some sharp discontinuity somewhere in your learning procedure, in general your action probabilities are changing smoothly as a function of the parameters, and smoothness is good for theoretical convergence guarantees. And this gives rise to actor-critic methods, which is finally going to close the loop on why I was spending so much time talking about value earlier and no time talking about action. One thing that I just think it didn't need to be this way, and it's so beautiful that it is this way, is that learning the state value is often a very, very helpful intermediate for learning a better policy through a kind of policy gradient method. In particular, the state value helps you reduce the variance in your updates, because rather than just updating in terms of the return or the Q value or whatever, you can subtract off this baseline and get something that is often called the advantage, right? Just the difference between the value I expect of the given the action that I took and the value that I would expect, not conditioned on any action, just relative to like the full policy distribution. So to define some terms here, the actor is directly learning the policy pi. The critic is learning the state value, and this lets us go from the Monte Carlo setting to a fully online bootstrap setting. And the second amazing thing about this, in addition to giving like a natural role for what a state value function would be doing computationally, is that the TD error becomes the like normatively correct teaching signal to use for these updates because it's an unbiased estimate of the advantage function. It's very easy to see this. We just take our mathematical expression for the TD error that I introduced before. You just take expectations on both sides. You realize that this term here is just the definition of the Q value, and boom, there you go. We see that the TD error is the expectation, or is an unbiased sample from the advantage function. So we can use our TD error to compute the policy gradient while also keeping only a single set of parameters for the critic. We don't need to separately learn a set of parameters for the Q function. And the final payoff, and I have like 10 minutes, so I think this is good. I'm like coming to a close here. Is that this actor-critic framework very naturally, I think, maps onto the anatomy of the basal ganglia. This is in some ways a very old idea, but early on people were sort of like reaching for maybe it's like the striosomes versus the matrix that are like implementing these different things. I think the modern incarnation holds that the ventral striatum is the critic. Again, this is where we see the strongest state value signals. I would argue anywhere in the brain. I would argue this is a distributional critic. And it explains the kind of coding that we see there. The dorsal striatum then becomes the actor, is the thing that is like, actively choosing, which action to take at a given time. To get to your question, if you record from the dorsal striatum, you see tons and tons of movement coding. People will argue about whether this is, doing something like selecting syllables from a discrete set of possible actions or doing more continuous motor control over a set of like kinematic parameters. But it is like very clear both anatomically and physiologically that the dorsal striatum is primarily concerned with this kind of movement control, just as you would expect from an actor. And of course, dopamine here is broadcasting a TD error, and this is the this is exactly the kind of teaching signal that is predicted for both the ventral striatal critic and the dorsal striatal actor to allow it to perform optimal behavior. This is in some ways, like, I think the canonical model of RL in the basal ganglia, but I don't think it is quite like as clear. It's not posed in as clear a way as it could. Very frequently, the second paper that I suggested, like the sort of optional paper from Yael Niv, sort of gets at this, but through a very roundabout way of saying like, oh, you don't need value after all, only for it to like come in the last section and say, oh, actually, like it turns out value is super useful for getting these policy gradient methods or these actor-critic methods off the ground. And they show some behavioral evidence for this. They show some neural evidence for this. I will say, like, the neural evidence gets a little bit complicated. DS projecting dopamine seems to be doing more than just vanilla TD errors. It's, the good news here is that it's like seems to be involved in action in some way, whether that's action initiation or something more subtle. There are certain ideas for how this might just operate as like a kind of corrective or a correction for the kind of teaching signal that you would want given multiple controllers or something like this. I think the jury is still out on exactly, first of all, what the nature of dorsal striatal dopamine signals are, and second, what the normative purpose of these are. But I do think it all mostly hangs together. Yeah, let's start here.
Yeah, I'm curious, like the dorsal striatum is supposed to be doing ubiquitous movement coding, but then that doesn't necessarily explain the kind of hierarchy or the expectation necessarily. I think like in terms of we do make very long-term plans that I don't know how well you could explain them based on signals which are well correlated to like my kinematics.
For sure.
And then also the other thing is like I'm not sure I understand how we go from like a sample based or like per sample thing to expectations over the entire policy within one circuit, I guess.
Okay, I'll try to, if I understood this, I understood the first part, so let me start there, and then we'll see how I do with the second part. So yeah, definitely there's a hierarchy of motor control. I broadly think of like, the most abstract representation of the brain tend to be frontal. Interesting thing about like the frontal cortex is that like it's everything that's like motor cortex and in front. So like like the more frontal you are, the more abstract your plans are, and the longer the timescales, and you go a bit more posterior, and you get to areas, like supplementary motor area or M2, and those are now you're taking your broad level plans, and now you're turning them into like a action plan, and then you get to M1, the primary motor cortex, and now you have like a more concrete sense of, okay, exactly where do I want to send my hand over to like grasp over here rather than over here. And then motor cortex, in addition to like directed descending projections, projects very, very heavily to, for example, dorsal striatum, which is maybe, you might think, sort of implementing or refining or giving you like online control over the precise plan. And so in this case, RL would be operating on this more sort of fine temporal scale, at least in terms of its projection to the actor and dorsal striatum. Potentially, there are other pathways for giving sort of higher level feedback at higher levels of abstraction to the cortical or supervisor.
I'm just thinking about like, this is a big problem also in kind of control theory generally, because we tend to have these structures of so I used to work on like robotics and drones and whatnot, and we tend to break things into these timescales, but then you get into these weird things where they start fighting each other because they don't realize that, there was a disturbance towards your next waypoint, but it was a disturbance from your current attitude. So then you fight back and go backwards. And this happens all the time. And when you look at like actual birds, for example, they don't have this thing where, if they're flying, they somehow, there's roughly equal power spectral density of wind going up and down. But if they're trying to go somewhere, they wind up going more up than down somehow, which indicates that they're not doing this attitude control where they're trying to fly exactly level. And they wind up also expending less energy than it would take to just do the line integral. But it's this kind of thing where it's like, I think that going beyond just the fine motor feedback to how does this influence the critic actually get all the way back to the plans is really important.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting. So like you can imagine, so I don't know, I haven't solved control theory. I'll let you know if I do. Here's an interesting anatomical fact about how the brain is structured. So I mentioned that there's this sort of like gradient from like anterior to posterior in the frontal cortex that is like taking abstract plans and converting them into like concrete motor plans. Well, those same very anterior parts of like prefrontal cortex that don't project directly to dorsal striatum do project directly to the critic in ventral striatum. So what's up with that? Like, well, maybe in principle that gives your striatal critic, like, it makes it better able to evaluate your performance in the context of the high level plan, and that maybe resolves the kind of action that you're talking about. That is one possible idea. Already, I alluded to this, but there's a really nice paper from Jack Lindsay. It's not in a actor-critic model. It's in some variant of Q-learning. I can send it to you if you want, but that basically says that in a case when you have multiple controllers, the right kind of correction to give to your teaching signal to dorsal striatum, which is trying to reconcile these different controllers, is a kind of like action prediction error, which is akin to some of the signals that we think that many groups are reporting seeing in dorsal striatal dopamine. So there are various ideas here about how to reconcile these different controllers operating at different scales. Very much an open and interesting problem. Okay, there are a couple hands raised in the chat. I want to get to. This is basically all I have, so we should just talk. Yeah. Eli, and I don't know who the other person is. And Leonard. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'll just give my questions kind of quickly. So when you say behavioral evidence here, could you explain how this is behavioral evidence for an advantage function being calculated? And then when you're talking about action prediction errors and movement coding, is that basically saying that you take the reafferent signal and use that to compute a representation of what movement was actually executed, which can then be compared against the intended movement?
Yes. So starting with the second question, yes, that is what I'm proposing. I don't feel very strongly about that, but there are like models to this effect that work. I'll share it in the channel because I think they're super interesting. This is
okay.
Jack.
So as a follow-up to that, would you say that the basal ganglia then is selecting actions or policies?
Yes. So I think it's doing policy learning, and part of doing policy learning is by selecting actions at each time point. Yeah, and there are. Does that, but I suspect that you mean something deeper, but I'm not getting it.
No, I mean like, so as in, twitching one muscle is an action in the RL sense.
Sure.
Contracting a single muscle, but then there's also a level of abstraction where an entire behavior, like, mouse pulls the lever,
Yeah. So
or
it's like a question about sort of
monkey
like chunking.
saccades left is also an action. So which kind of action do we mean?
Yeah, so I think anatomically the striatum is parceled up into a lot of like topographic zones. So there's like a part of the striatum that is more like orofacial, and this is like the ventrolateral striatum. There's other parts that control like trunk movements or like limb movements. I think like all of these things are basically their own little like sub actors within the dorsal striatum and are capable of coordinating these things. And then when it comes to chunking or like coordinating larger muscle groups, I think this is, again, an interesting open question. People like Angrabiel have like worked on these ideas for a long time. It definitely seems like the striatum is crucial for chunking these things. I don't know exactly how that works, other than thinking of it as like a sort of an option in the like classic options framework sense, where we basically have a sub policy that's specific to a certain option, and that might have very strong temporal dependencies of like first I flex this muscle, then I contract this muscle, whatever, something like that. And the first part of your question, very quickly, the behavioral evidence, I would say it is it's not supposed to be behavioral evidence for an advantage function. It's supposed to be behavioral evidence for direct policy learning, by which I mean, if if you're in an environment where an action the same action that leads to the same reward, but the rewards are less overall, then you're going to learn to take that action more. There's going to be a stronger preference for taking that action, and that's going to carry over, such that if you've learned that action in that lean environment, you're going to be more likely to use it in like a medium environment compared to that same action that you learned in a rich environment and being selected in the medium environment. So you can check out that paper if you want more detail about it, but I think it's just the idea that we have bona fide action preferences separate from the values to which they're attached. That might be more, the values themselves are not dependent on the environment broadly, but the extent to which you learn to choose that action does depend on what the other alternatives are in the environment. Leonard has a hand raised.
Thanks. This is actually something that maybe is connected with what Eli said and like the sort of unstructured behavior thought from earlier. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on like the difference between learning a behavior and learning the function or the process that produces that behavior, and how that like comes into play with long-term planning and that type of stuff.
So like it's like kind of a learning to learn thing. Is that
Yeah. Like learning to plan, for example, you could have this planning process running in the brain somewhere, and when you receive this like reward for taking an action, you might be adjusting the planning process that came to that, rather than saying, okay, I'm just going to increase, the like Q value for this particular action.
Yeah, I think this is best answered in the context of model-based RL, which I like intentionally glossed over. So I'm sorry about that, but you can just dwelling on the details, just looking at the schematic. Right, there's this whole model learning part. So like, in some cases like AlphaGo, for example, the model is fixed and just given to the agent, and it's just like the dynamics of the game of Go. In other cases like mu0, for example, the model is actually learned. And I think there's an analogy between what you're talking about and this model learning component, right? Which is its own thing, which can be its own algorithm that can involve certain priors, or just directly be caching a bunch of experience. And as you learn the model, you're gonna use that to make different updates to your policy, potentially in the limit allowing you to make sort of like very rapid adaptation and this kind of learning to learn or meta learning.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sorry.
I think, I think that's all I have. Great. I don't need to summarize. I know it's getting late. It's not too long after 11, so I feel like I did okay. So with that, I just wanted to close and thank everyone, and I will stop the recording, and then we can chat for as long as people want to. But thanks a lot for your attention and for your awesome questions.
Another